Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada. Reading from Bhagavad Gita, as it is, chapter 13, texts 8 to 12. The chapter is entitled Nature, the Enjoyer, and Consciousness. My instructions are that these texts are to be divided, so I'm simply going to do the first two. But read the whole translation, but then just read the purport that covers the first two texts and leave the rest for Advaita Prabhu, who carries this on not tomorrow but the following day, because tomorrow is Kirtan Day. So I'm not sure whether we have the correct address. Speak of the devil. I was just saying that you're carrying on with this the day after tomorrow. So I'm just going to do the first two texts. But I'll read the whole translation because otherwise it'll be a bit weird. Yeah. But otherwise the purport, I'm only going to do half the purport covering the first two texts. Is that okay?
How long you want to do?
Because otherwise it'll finish the purport and then I'll have to finish class. So I'll be doing, it's okay, Prabhu, we can just read out, it's all right. So this one's number 13, is it?
How many pages is the purport actually?
So my instructions were for 8 to 12? Pages. Yeah, well the purport, I'm going to be reading about 2.5 pages, just over 2.5 pages, and I'll leave the other 2 pages for you. Because I went through it today, and the 2.5 pages, that's just covering the first 2 verse texts, right? So it's pretty kind of matched up. Prabhuji, can I give you the... Lord Balaram here, thanks.
Yes,
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I think we have 13, we'll just leave it and I'll read it out. Indriyateshu vairagyam anahankara evacha janma mrityu jara vyadi Dukha dushanu darshanam. Second text, Ashaktir, that's text 9, this is text 10. Ashaktir anabhishvanga putra dara grihadishu nityang charsanma chittatvam ishta anisto papatishu. I'll just do the word for word. Amaani tvam. Humility. Adambi tvam. Pridelessness. Ahimsa. Non-violence. Chaantihi. Tolerance. Arjavam. Simplicity. Acharya Upashanam, approaching a bona fide spiritual master. Shaucham, cleanliness. Stairyam, steadfastness. Atma Vinigraha, control. Indriya, Ateshu, in the matter of the senses. Vairagyam, renunciation. Anahankaraha, being without false egoism. Eva, certainly. Cha, also. Janma, birth. Mrityu, death. Jara, old age. Vyadi, disease. Old age, distress. Yep. Just seeing where our text ends. Jara, old age, vyadi, disease. Dukkha, distress. Dosha, fault. Anudarshanam, observing. Ashaktihi, without attachment. Okay. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Key. Humility, pridelessness, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, and self-control. Renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, non-attachment to children, wife, home, and the rest, and even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to me, resorting to solitary places, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these are thus declared to be knowledge, and what is contrary to these is ignorance. Purport. Better get a drink first. Danke, Prabhuji. The process of knowledge is sometimes misunderstood by less intelligent men as being the interaction of the field of activity, but actually this is the real process of knowledge. If one accepts this process and the possibility of approaching the absolute truth exists, this is not the interaction of the tenfold elements as described before. This is actually the means to get out of it. Of all the descriptions of the process of knowledge, the most important point is described in the first line of the 10th verse. The process of knowledge terminates in unalloyed devotional service to the Lord. So if one does not approach, or is not able to approach, the transcendental service of the Lord, then the other 19 items are of no particular value. But if one takes the devotional service in full Krishna consciousness, the other 19 items automatically develop within him. The principle of accepting a spiritual master, as mentioned in the 7th verse, is essential. Even for one who takes the devotional service, it is most important. Transcendental life begins when one accepts a bona fide spiritual master. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna, clearly states here that the process of knowledge is the actual path. Anything speculated beyond this is nonsense. As for the knowledge outlined here, the items may be analyzed as follows. Humility means that one should not be anxious to have the satisfaction of being honored by others. The material conception of life makes us very eager to receive honor from others. But from the point of view of a man in perfect knowledge, who knows that he is not this body, anything honor or dishonor pertaining to this body is useless. One should not be hankering after this material deception. People are very anxious to be famous for their religion, and consequently, sometimes it is found that without understanding the principles of religion, one enters into some group which is not actually following religious principles, and then wants to advertise himself as a religious mentor. As for actual advancement in spiritual science, one should have a test to see how far he is progressing. He can judge by these items. Non-violence is generally taken to mean not killing or destroying the body, but actually non-violence means means not to put others into distress. People in general are trapped in ignorance in the material concept of life, and they perpetually suffer material pains. So unless one elevates people to spiritual knowledge, one is practicing violence. One should try his best to distribute real knowledge to the people so that they may become enlightened and leave this material entanglement. That is non-violence. Tolerance means that one should be practiced to bear insult and dishonor from others. If one is engaged in the advancement of spiritual knowledge, there will be so many insults and much dishonor from others. This is expected because material nature is so constituted. Even a boy like Prahlad, only 5 years old, was engaged in the cultivation of spiritual knowledge, was endangered when his father became antagonistic to his devotion. The father tried to kill him in so many ways, but Prahlad tolerated him. So for making advancement in spiritual knowledge, there may be so many impediments, but we should be tolerant and continue our progress with determination. Simplicity means that without diplomacy, one should be so straightforward that he can disclose the real truth even to an enemy. As for acceptance of the spiritual master, that is essential, because without the instruction of the bona fide spiritual master, one cannot progress in the spiritual science. One should approach the spiritual master with all humility and offer him all services so that he will be pleased to bestow his blessings upon the disciple. Because a bona fide spiritual master is a representative of Krishna, if he bestows any blessing upon his disciple, that will make the disciple immediately advance without the disciples following the regulated principles. Or the regulated principles will be easier for one who has served the spiritual master without reservation. Cleanliness is essential for making advancement in spiritual life. There are two kinds of cleanliness, external and internal. External cleanliness means taking a bath, but for internal cleanliness, one has to think of Krishna always and chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This process cleans the accumulated dust of past karma from the mind. Steadiness means that one should be very determined to make progress in spiritual life. Without such determination, one cannot make tangible progress. And self-control means that one should not accept anything which is detrimental to the path of spiritual progress. One should become accustomed to this and reject anything which is against the path of spiritual progress. This is real renunciation. The senses are so strong that they are always anxious to have sense gratification. One should not cater to these demands which are not necessary. The senses should only be gratified to keep the body fit, so that one can discharge his duty in advancing in spiritual life. The most important and uncontrollable sense is the tongue. If one can control the tongue, then there is every possibility of controlling the other senses. The function of the tongue is to taste and to vibrate. Therefore, by systematic regulation, the tongue should always be engaged in tasting remnants of foodstuffs offered to Krishna and chanting Hare Krishna. As far as the eyes are concerned, they should not be allowed to see anything but the beautiful form of Krishna. That will control the eyes. Similarly, the ears should be engaged in hearing about Krishna, and the nose in smelling the flowers offered to Krishna. This is the process of devotional service. And it is understood here that Bhagavad Gita is simply expounding the science of devotional service. Devotional service is the main and sole objective. Unintelligent commentators on the Gita try to divert the mind of the reader to other subjects, but there is no other subject in Bhagavad Gita but devotional service. False ego means accepting this body as oneself. When one understands that he is not his body and his spirit soul, that is real ego. Ego is there. False ego is condemned, but not real ego. In the Vedic literature, it is said, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, I am spirit. This I am, the sense of self, also exists in the liberated stage of self-realization. The sense of I am is ego, but when the sense of I am is applied to this false body, it is false ego. When the sense of the self is applied to reality, that is real ego. There are some philosophers who say we should give up our ego, but we cannot give up our ego because ego means identity. We ought, of course, to give up the false identification with the body. One should try to understand the distress of accepting birth, death, old age, and disease. There are descriptions in various Vedic literatures of birth. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, the world of the unborn, the child's stay in the womb of the mother is suffering, etc., are all graphically described. It should be thoroughly understood that birth is distressful, because we forget how much distress we have suffered within the womb of the mother. We do not make any solution to the repetition of birth and death. Similarly, at the time of death, there are all kinds of sufferings, and they are also mentioned in the authoritative scriptures. These should be discussed. And as far as diseases and old age are concerned, everyone gets practical experience. No one wants to be diseased, and no one wants to become old, but there is no avoiding these. Unless we have a pessimistic view of this material life, considering the distresses of birth, death, old age, and disease, then there is no impetus for our making advancement in spiritual life. So this is a power-packed purport. You could spend a class on a few of these sentences. There's so much in it. There's also a very nice outline in chapter 16, divine and demonic natures, that systematically goes through all the characteristics of a saintly person, which I thought was really good, very instructive in terms of just day-to-day, what are the qualities that we are actually supposed to develop and increase as devotees, or in my case, aspiring devotee of the Lord. So, I remember when I first joined up, I very much had trouble with the whole concept of humility, in terms of what does that actually mean. I found it very difficult to incorporate the qualities or identify what humility means in context of devotional service to the Lord, because particularly in Western culture, it's generally considered cowardice to allow people to dominate or infringe on your rights. So this is the nature of the, let's say, the descendants of the Kshatriyas in the West, that there is a tendency to see a servile attitude as weakness or as cowardice. And unfortunately, we are brought up with this attitude that you're supposed to defend your rights and stand up for yourself and stand up for your individuality, as opposed to other cultures, particularly in Asia, that have a more greater idea of the community. And dare I say, Germany too has a better understanding of the community in general, I'd say, than other Anglo-Saxon countries. To a certain extent, it's a promotion of individualism as opposed to community. But the Krishna conscious person is only ever thinking his position in relationship to Krishna, and how he can serve Krishna better, and to that end the other devotees of the Lord. So this is described in Prabhupada's literature that it's literally an inverse of the material world, whereby the servant of the servant is actually in a more elevated position than the supposed controller or leader of an organization. And that is directly opposite our experience in the material world, where the CEO or the chairman has the prestige of the organization. So how do we apply practically this notion of humility? Because it's it can be very difficult in a practical sense, particularly if you have feelings that somehow you're being exploited or taken advantage of, and then it might be difficult. You think that, well, okay, I can imbibe this attitude, but if others don't imbibe this attitude within this organization, then there is room for abuse. Because what happens if one person doesn't imbibe the spirit of humility? and the rest are. So this is problematic from a spiritual perspective. However, within the Vaishnav culture, we can rest assured that should offences occur, the devotee who can recite the Shikshastika or even just imbibe the spirit of the Shikshastika, in that we recite every morning, Trinada Pisa Nechina, Torora Pisa Isnina, Manina, Manadenya, Gitanyara Sarahari, Nadanam Najanam Nasundarim, Kavitam Vajigashva, Kambiye, Mama Jamarib Jamamishvare, Bhavatad Bhakti, Hoite Gitvai, etc. So it goes on. But what that means is that even if we do see blemishes within the spiritual atmosphere where it's not being properly applied, in the long run, the devotee who can imbibe the spirit of humility will inevitably triumph in those situations, because under the Vaishnav etiquette and Vaishnav rules, the one that perpetrates continual offences, the atimata, the mad elephant disease, by trying to dominate other devotees or mistreat other devotees. I'm not saying, of course, it's happened here at Sabachalam, but I'm just saying in the greater organization, when this has happened in the past or happens, what occurs is that the offender will be removed. The offender will be removed for he or she's own sake, so that they don't continue to offend other devotees. So it's a very scientific process, in that on the surface it may seem that someone is dominating or in charge, but under the laws of Krishna consciousness, such persons will be rectified one way or the other by Krishna. So it's a very difficult, you could really do a whole class, you could do a lecture series just on humility. I think it's very complex and difficult on the one hand, and yet it's very simple on the other hand. But I think it does require an application of intelligence, and that I think, in my experience, if you do have feelings that somehow you're being mistreated or something's unfair, the best thing to do is just to stay calm, to not engage in any argument that's very displeasing to the Lord. For devotees to argue, that's not good. So it's always better to be the one that withdraws, and really just take it up with your authorities in a calm and rational manner, if that is. So, I mean, I'm just trying to offer some advice for things that I struggled with when I first came to Krishna consciousness, and that was this concept of humility. Because if you're being taught to be humble, but then if there are leaders in the organization that you don't believe that applies, it's better that you speak to your authorities about it to get clarification. So always seek clarification and don't suffer in silence. I think that's the best advice that I could give him in that regard. And perhaps a good definition of humility is concerning the next point, which is pridelessness. And that is a really good way to explain it, because humility is really a symptom of pridelessness. So there's two words in English which are similar but different, and that is one's pridefulness. Does anyone know the other one? Very, very similar. Anyone guess? Also starts with P. So pridelessness, and this is directly related to humility, so I'm going to really tease this out. So pridelessness is is an attribute, and there's another word to describe a very similar attribute, which is related. Starts with P. And that word is pride. So I think this is a really excellent way, if I may say, to discuss humility. In that initially when I joined, I was thinking, there's a saying, have you no pride, which means that you should keep certain standards of etiquette, of respectfulness, of politeness, of thinking of others, courtesy. One should have pride in these things. And just as Prabhupada says, one should be proud to be a devotee. So how do you be proud? How can you be simultaneously proud to be a devotee, yet simultaneously humble? How is that possible? How can you be proud of being a part of ISKCON, yet also humble? So this is my realization on this, is that there's a difference between pride and being prideful. So pride has nothing to do actually with being puffed up. Pride has nothing to do with arrogance. Pride has nothing to do with conceit. But pridefulness does. Is it prideful? So this is just as this is described in the Bible as well, as the pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, no? So pride is you Catholic background? Catholic background, Prabhu, from Poland? Little bit? Okay, I thought they're pretty pro-Catholic, yeah. So, you'd know about this term. So pride. So I think that's a really, really helpful way to think about it, is to think about that, yes, we have pride. We're proud to be servants of other devotees. We're proud to be in ISKCON, but we're not prideful, because prideful indicates that it's going to your ego. You're then identifying with it as yourself, when really you're not. You're not part of that. So we identify with being servants of Krishna, but we don't identify as being Krishna, which is the decisive difference between devotee and Mayavadi. Non-violence. So non-violence is a... how long are we going to Prabhu? 45 usually? Okay, I'll just have to go a little rapido here. So non-violence, this is a delightful explanation of violence that Prabhupada is stating here. He's saying that, Srila Prabhupada is saying that just the denial of the education of spiritual life is another form of violence. And this is what the materialistic leaders are constantly perpetrating on the populace. It's not only that they're taxing them, they're endorsing slaughterhouses, they're mostly endorsing abortion, but they're also perpetrating this violence in terms of not providing spiritual solutions, not giving them access to the Vedic literature. And again, this is the non-violent attitude of the devotee, that he delivers this knowledge. The glorious Sankirtan devotees who are distributing Prabhupada's books all around the world are described as Mahatmas by Prabhupada, and meaning great soul, of course. And they are doing a very great service in terms of non-violent service in providing this information, so people have some opportunity, some means of escaping samsara, the endless cycle of birth and death. And again, not only that, but giving them the opportunity to approach a bona fide spiritual master, right? It's giving them access to the writings of Srila Prabhupada. So Prabhupada has emphasized this point repeatedly, actually, in this purport. Tadvidi pranipatena paripasnena sevaya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattvadarshina. Jnaninas is connecting him to Prabhupada, who is replete with full transcendental knowledge. Tattvadarshina, tattva. He has had darshan with the truth. Tattvadarshana. So Prabhupada sees the truth, right? So the spiritual masters, they get an opportunity or the people get an opportunity to meet a bona fide spiritual master, to chant Hare Krishna amongst devotees, to take initiation from a ISKCON spiritual master, and to escape the cycle of birth and death. Janma kama cha me divyam, ivam yo veti tattva, chakvadeham punarjanma, punarjanma na vidite. So all they have to do is remember Krishna. Very simple process. Just have to remember Krishna, time of death. That's the deal. That's the bargain that Krishna is making. As long as you can remember. But the problem is that this material entrapment is so heavy. It's so strong. It's so powerful. This identification that we have, particularly for family. I mean, even for people that aren't married, that don't have wife and children, the connections for family is actually very strong, even in the West. Prabhupada noticed it was even greater in India. And he said that's probably the better thing, the best thing about the West is that they're not so attached to their parents, and they can take to Krishna consciousness when they're young. So although Prabhupada obviously very much appreciated the Indian culture, there was the intense, connection with the parents, because they're good parents. So that connection's very, very strong, and that's even without having children. What to speak of when you have children? So it sounds easy to remember Krishna at the time of death, but there's so many distractions, so difficult. So one has to be expert actually to be able to do this, to manage a family and to do all this. Like a Dvaita Prabhu, he's very very balanced and managed to balance all this all. It's actually glorious. It's actually a very good example. So not so easy. Not so easy. So, tolerance. I'm going to have to really speed this up now. Tolerance. Tam stitikshashva bharata. Matra spasas kunteya sitos na sukudugada. Tam stitikshashva bharata. One must learn to tolerate. This really is related to humility and pridelessness. Is to tolerate the impulses. Vachovagam manasa kradovagam. Kradovagam is krodha, is anger. So the ability to control your anger. This is described in Nectar of Instruction. This is how one becomes qualified, how one develops the adhikari to take on disciples. He must be able to control anger. So how do you control anger? You must be tolerant. Titikshashva. One has to be tolerant. Simplicity. Simplicity, Prabhupada defines simplicity as you tell your enemy what you're going to do. Who does that? Who does that? But that's the level, that's the standard. That's the standard Prabhupada's trying to set. Without diplomacy. Without diplomacy. I think Christ had a slightly different standard. Lord Jesus Christ spoke of that one should be soft as a dove and wise as a snake. And there's parallels actually in Krishna consciousness. If one is cunning, one should also be cunning. So there's also that. I mean, one has to be practical. But Prabhupada's at least outlining the standard. So the standard is that we cannot be duplicitous. We cannot be brahmana. We cannot be on the highest level and be duplicitous in any way. So the Kshatriya, however, has to deal with many unpleasant things, unpleasant people. And so it's described that the Kshatriya, for the sake of diplomacy, may be able to be diplomatic, right? Be diplomatic. So it's like the English are the world champions at diplomacy. And they've learnt this from invading 80% of the countries in the world and dominating. So by force, by brute force. So they've learnt how to be diplomatic. And diplomacy is really lying to get what you want politically. So devotees have to be devoid of that. Approaching a bona fide spiritual master, we just covered that. So cleanliness. Truthfulness is a form of cleanliness, isn't it? Is it not? So that's external cleanliness. That's internal and external cleanliness is being truthful. And taking bath. A brahmana must take bath at least 2 times a day. Steadiness and self-control. So this, in my view, what immediately comes to mind is that one has to be balanced and have control of the mind. So the mind will give us so much trouble if we give it enough rope to contemplate the objects of the senses, right? Jayato vishayam pumsha, sangasteshu bhajayate. So sangas means sangha, from associating with these desires. The desire comes into being just from contemplating. While contemplating the objects of the senses, a person develops attachment for them. And from such attachment, lust develops. So, control of the mind and remaining balanced. Sounds simple, very difficult. Unfortunately, as Juna described, the mind is like a hurricane. So, very, very difficult. And so, coincidentally, the next line is renunciation of the objects of sense gratification. So, which we covered. Absence of false ego. So, ego is there. So, what is our ego? Our ego is aham brahmasmi. Aham brahmasmi. Jivara svarupa hoya Krishnera nityadas. Jivara svarupa hoya Krishnera nityadas. Jivara svarupa hoya Krishnera nityadas. That my position is a servitor of Lord Krishna. Jivara, jiva. Svarup, my position. Svarupa hoya Krishnera, Krishna. Krishnera nityadas. Nityadas. Nityadas means what, Bjorn Prabhu? What does Nitya Das mean? Das means servitor? Yeah, Nitya? Prabhuji? Prabhuji? Was bedeutet Nitya Das? Nitya Das? Nitya Das? Eternal servant. Jivara Svarupa Hoya Krishnera Nitya Das. If you take one thing out of the lecture today, that's it. So that is your ego. That's your ego. So, not Jivara Swarupa Hoya Krishnera Nitya Prabhu. No. Not that. Jivara, I'm eternally the Prabhu of Krishna. Eternally the master of Krishna. No. That's what everyone's thinking in the material world. But it's not Nitya Prabhu, we are Nitya Das. We are Nitya Das. Okay? So our ego is understood, complete and clean when we understand we're the servants of Krishna. Bas. The perception of evil of birth, death, old age, and disease. So this is good to keep this in mind, to keep the mind in check, to keep the balance, to keep a steady mind, to get the steadiness, to keep the motivation. It's important to perceive the evils that are out there in terms of birth, death, old age, and disease. And in the West, they're very expert at hiding this, at concealing this phenomena, is it not? We don't see really people diseased. We don't really see people dying. We don't see, particularly with corona, we don't see the excess deaths. We don't see so much that is going on. When actually, it would be helpful for people's spiritual lives if they saw this, because then it would make them consider. So perhaps when they're at a funeral, as someone close to them perishes, then for that day or so, they might start thinking, oh, what's it all about? He was there the other day, now he's gone. or my dear mum, or whatever. It's how do I go on without them? And so perhaps for that day they then consider it, but only because they're part of that particular party that went to the funeral or was involved in the ceremony. But otherwise, it's very healthy to keep these in mind rather than pretend that they don't exist. Because it is a fact, it is a well-established fact that all efforts are eventually void in this world, in that none of this can be taken with us, and the series of problems that we're encountered with in life are never ending. They do not end. Problems in the material world do not end. As long as you're breathing, they are there. So, and that is crowned with the final problem, which is insoluble, and that is death. So, it is of the highest intelligence to prepare for this occasion by becoming Krishna consciousness, by becoming Krishna conscious. This is true intelligence. This is the highest intelligence. So really, Krishna consciousness is the process of removing all distractions and obstacles on this lifelong meditation of Krishna, so that we can have the ultimate desired effect of being Krishna conscious at the time of death with no distractions and no attachments. And that is the sanam bonum of Krishna consciousness and the ultimate goal of life. Hare Krishna. How we go? Pretty good. Any cues? Any questions? I'll just read the translation again, or no? No? Yes? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, so Mataji was just saying that she was watching a film. Was this just a normal film? Es war ein ganz normales Film, oder? Von ISKCON oder Indien? Aus Indien, okay. Und in that film, they were describing how even if you just have one, shall we say, significant desire, or was it just one insignificant desire, then you'll have to come back to this material world. Yeah, so I cannot speak to that with my degree of self-realization, but I think we can rely. I think we ultimately rely on Guru and Gauranga at the time of death. So I'm not sure it's so realistic to think that we're going to be pure Vaishnavas at the time of death. I don't think that's realistic. But but to that extent, there was a lecture given by Srila Prabhupada, and perhaps some of you have heard of it, where Prabhupada was stating that even if you become 90% Krishna conscious, you'll go back to Godhead. And then he was getting off the Vyasa-san, and then he got off the Vyasa-san, and then he said, actually, even if you're 80% Krishna consciousness, you'll go back to Krishna. And I think there was one more time, and then he was at the end of walking down the end of the hall, and he said, 70% Krishna conscious, you'll go back to Krishna. So it really depends on Guru and Gauranga, but ultimately it does depend on yourself, right? Because you're the pilot of the vessel, and we depend on Guru, but that's why it's more important to depend on the instructions of Guru rather than to depend on Guru. That's why the instructions are actually more important, right? So the Vani is more important than the Vapu. The instruction's more important. Because we can have certainty if we follow the instructions. We can't have certainty if we go with a hat in our hand and we really haven't followed as best as we could have, isn't it? Is it? Isn't it? It's like that. So it's a really good question. Thank you for the question. It's a really good question. It's a really good question. Yeah, it's a very good question. So I mean, and there's also I'll tie it up, Bjorn, Prabhu, and I'll get to your question. There's also other examples of devotees who came back to ISKCON just before dying, and there were several, and these very auspicious things happened at the time of their death. Like their mouth opened, and it's like they could see that the spirit had left the mouth, which is very auspicious. There were many reports of this, of former prominent ISKCON devotees who came back in the last few weeks of their lives, and they had extremely auspicious endings to their lives. So we cannot underestimate, it's very difficult to estimate or underestimate the mercy of Lord Nityananda and Guru. At the same time, we shouldn't have a relaxed attitude in terms of, well, I don't really have to try that hard, and I really don't have to be strict with observing these instructions. And I'm not at all suggesting that's what that's what was implied by the question, but I'm just saying that that's an important point. Hare Krishna. Hare Bol. Prabhuji?
Because Prabhupada gives us the perfection, the ultimate goal, which is the pure love to Krishna. But some, or very often, I think that there's not enough time to develop my consciousness to this level, that after this life, we will reach this goal.
All right, so you're worried about the time constraint? How old are you again? 20? I believe another devotee cited this. I think it was Advaita Prabhu. I'm not sure. Recent lecture with regard to that he was actually quoting Prabhupada in Melbourne, Australia, and the question was, how long does it take to become Krishna conscious? And Prabhupada said, in a moment you can become Krishna conscious. So it can be a moment, it can be several lifetimes. So again, it depends on the practitioner. It's a combination. I mean, it's a combination. It's very unlikely, particularly where ISKCON is now, that someone has come to ISKCON who has not practiced formally. So they're already quite determined. They've already undertaken amazing austerities, and they've already, generally speaking, it can be assumed that they are already advanced from previous births. So to say it's just your determination in this lifetime, I think one can't really say that either. So because we don't know the Prabhus that are coming here and the Madhajis that are coming here. We don't know how many lifetimes they've been practicing. We don't know. But you can see with some people, they just take to it and it's like a duck to water, and they don't have any problems. That's quite rare, because normally people will have problems. There'll be problems. So I've had problems also in Krishna consciousness, so it's pretty common. But you can notice by how expert they are, and if they don't have any problems, then you can see that this person, wow, they've really, they must have practiced seriously in past lives, because it's very unusual. So, I mean, it's honestly, it is past endeavors, past sukriti, and it's your determination in this lifetime. But you can rest assured that if you follow follow the regular principles, chanting 16 rounds, your chances are extremely high of going back to Godhead in this lifetime, if that's what you're practicing at the time of death. Be it sannyas, brahmachari, grihasta, or vanaprastha. Unless you want to come back. Not advised. Not advised. This is the purport I'm getting from Prabhupada's purport. The purport of the purport is not advised to come back. That's reserved for Mahabhagavats and Shakyava Savatars. Any other questions? Or comments? Or additions? Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much indeed. Hare Krishna. Hare Bo. Hogo is Srila Prabhupada. Hogo is Shri Guru Gauranga.
Janardhana, Prabhu ki jai.